We have looked at already Romans 1 to 4, Paul's theology of justification. Justification by faith apart from the law for Jews and Gentiles alike. And we're looking now in this lecture at Romans 5 to 8, which is Paul's theology of sanctification, our progressive growth in holiness, the living out of the Christian life. And Paul is going to focus his discussion of this on our transition from death to life. Death in Adam, life in Christ. Death to sin. We've died to sin. Now we live in righteousness. The Jews have died to the law, and now we all live by the Spirit. So it's kind of a three-part design to this section. And this section really has a little bit less to do with the whole Jew-Gentile divide, and it focuses more on objections to Paul's gospel. Certainly these chapters are divided by questions, objections raised against Paul's gospel, and he says, by no means, and he responds to those objections. However, here in this first section, Paul very clearly addresses both Jews and Gentiles by going all the way back to Adam. And you can see kind of what he's doing here. He's opened up his Bible to Genesis chapter 3, and he's saying, man, as a result of Adam's disobedience, now all men are condemned. And death has reigned since that time. But because of Jesus' obedience, the offer of justification is given to all. And now we, as those who have accepted this invitation, we reign in life. And some people have kind of called this idea like federal headship and Adam's sin there in Genesis 3 being imputed on us. And that is one way of understanding it. What is certainly clear is that as a result of Adam's sin, sin in general has entered into the world, and with it, death. Let's look at that. And here we are, Romans 5, verse 12. Just as sin came into the world through one man Adam, and death through sin, so death spread to all men. Why? Because all men sinned. So we have this contrast between the first Adam and the last Adam. But in our union with the last Adam, in our union with Christ, what is true of him becomes true of us. And the righteousness of God, the righteousness of Jesus, is imputed on our behalf. And that's just, that's amazing. And this section is going to end with introducing a little bit of conflict. It's going to be a conflict that's going to hinge the objection in chapter 6. So take a look at that introducing of conflict. In verse 20, Paul's going to say that the law came in to increase the trespass. Whoa. So you're saying that as a result of the Mosaic law, sin increased? There was more sin after the law? Oof, that's kind of hard to swallow. And that objection is going to be answered in chapter 7. And then it says that where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. So the objection then in the next chapter is, well then, should we continue to sin that grace may abound? By no means, Paul says. So now we're in our second section, died to sin, we live to righteousness. Should we continue to sin that grace may abound? No, Paul says. How can we continue to sin who have died to sin? Now, this is just further implications of our union with Jesus. What is true of him becomes true of us. He died, so we died with him. And in that death, we died to sin. But just as Jesus was raised, so we also are raised with Christ. But this is the neat part. We raised that we may walk in newness of life. It's like the new creation, the resurrection body and spirit has crashed into the fallen world, fallen as a result of Adam's sin. And now we have the power and ability to walk in newness of life and take that into our battle against sin. And we know that we can be more than conquerors because as a result of our death to sin, we are no longer slaves to sin. And this is just so powerful, we need to look at it in the text. It really is poignant in verses 6 and 7. We know that our old self was crucified with him. We died with Christ in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. We're no longer in bondage to sin. Now, there's just, like that wasn't enough. Paul is going to go on to give us just a beautiful and a powerful application of this theology. We all want to defeat our sin, right? We want to conquer our sin and grow in holiness. And how do we do that? Well, Paul teaches us step number one is it's a mental exercise. We must consider ourselves dead to sin. I must think, David, you are dead to sin. And look where Paul says this. You must, verse 11, consider yourselves dead to sin, alive to God. Step one. Step two, therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body anymore. And look at this word reign, how it shows up again and again. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, but now we will reign in life through the free gift of righteousness, because grace now reigns. Therefore, sin doesn't have to. Now, this final section in the sanctification column here, this is in chapter 7 to calling it 8a. I think it's through verse 30 of chapter 8. There's a bit of a shift. So I said that Paul was addressing both Jews and Gentiles here, and he certainly is. But in the first 6 verses of chapter 7, Paul very clearly turns his attention specifically to the Jews. Brother Jews, I'm talking to you guys right now. Let me show you. Okay, chapter 7. Do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law. He's speaking specifically to Jews. And just to kind of prove that point, later in chapter 11, he's going to speak specifically to Gentiles. See this? Verse 13, now I am speaking to you, Gentiles. So usually, for the vast majority of the book of Romans, he's talking to all audiences, but there's a couple of points where it's significant and important that he's speaking directly to either Jew or Gentile. And this is one of those cases in, scroll down a bit, in chapter 7. And he argues, he's saying that the Jews have died to the law. It's another implication of their union with Christ. We've died to sin, and Jews who were under the old covenant, under the law, have died to that covenant. He makes the analogy to a married woman, and when that married woman, if her husband dies, she becomes a widow, and she can lawfully marry someone else. So what Paul is saying, you've died to the old covenant, and now you can enter into the new covenant, marry Christ, as it were. And Paul's going to continue by speaking about some further implications about this relationship with the law, and it's a little bit confusing and it can certainly be misunderstood. So let's muddy the waters a little bit. So look at verse 8. This is tricky stuff. He says, for apart from the law, sin lies dead. Okay. And then he says, I was once alive apart from the law, but when the law came, well, then sin came alive and I died. Wait, what? The very commandment, the law which promised life, proved to be death to me. Those are some controversial statements there, Paul. Hold up. Are you trying to tell me that the law resulted in sin and death? And we have another one of those moments where they're going to accuse Paul and say, you're saying that the law led to sin. And he, of course, is going to say, by no means. It's not the fault of the law, for the law, he says, is holy and righteous and good. No, it is the sinful nature. It is the fault of sin as a result of Adam's disobedience. That is what caused death and sin to reign even more after the law was introduced. Let's see, should we look at that in the text? Yes, we should. Okay. See, here's this double question. What then shall we say? Is the law sin? No. Did that which was good, that which is good, the law, did that bring death to me? No, it was sin, Paul says. And he's going to broaden this discussion a little bit more. So I mentioned that he was talking to the Jews in the first handful of verses of chapter 7, but then he's gonna broaden it by introducing another law. So we have the law of Moses here, but he's going to talk about the law of sin and death as well, and that's a law that we all are in bondage to, or were in bondage to. See this? There's a second law in verse 22. For I delight in the law of God, the first law, in my inner being, but I see in my members another law. Verse 8 calls this the law of sin and death. In my members there's another law, and this law wages war against the law of my mind and makes me captive to the law of sin, which dwells in my members. He's talking about the sinful nature that came from Adam. But the Spirit, he says, the Spirit, it has two purposes here. First off, it fulfills the law, the Mosaic law, fulfills that requirement, but then it also sets us free from the law of sin and death. And this little section here is in the first 4 verses of chapter 8. It sets us free from the law of sin and death. There's no condemnation for the law of the Spirit. There's a third law, right? You have the Mosaic law, we have the law of sin and death, you have the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death, because God has done what the law, the Mosaic law, weakened by the flesh, or you could say the sinful nature, could not do. You see, there were things that the law could not accomplish. It could not produce righteousness in us. It could only demand it. But the Spirit fulfilled the righteous requirement of the law in us. And how did it do that? Or how is it progressively doing that, I guess you may say? Well, as we walk by the Spirit, as we live by the Spirit, Paul is going to be saying in Romans 8:5-30, as we set our minds on the things of the Spirit. And all of these things are things that we do in the present, in the here and now, in this age, in this life. But while we're walking by the Spirit, we're waiting. We are waiting for hope, the hope of glory. And there's a number of things that are also happening, further things that are taking place in this life while we are waiting, which is described for us here in these verses. Let's take a look at them. What else is happening in this age as we walk by the Spirit while we are waiting for the hope of glory? Well, what will life be like in this age? Well, there will be suffering, Paul says. I consider the present sufferings not to be compared to the coming glory or the coming hope. So we will suffer, but what about God? How's God going to respond? What's he up to in this present age? 3 things. First, the Spirit is interceding for us in the present age with groans that words cannot express. Second, God is working all things together for good. There's no accident that this section begins with suffering and it concludes with God working all things together for good. Third, what else is happening? What is God up to in this age while we are waiting for hope in our suffering? God is conforming us to the image of his Son. And remember how I said that each of these major sections are going to conclude with a doxological worship, praise, confessional moment? Well, we've already seen how this section kind of concludes with our hope in the midst of suffering. And Paul is just going to bubble over into praise with 3 who questions. Let's look at those quick, and then we'll call this lecture a wrap. Who, he asks, who can be against us? Who can condemn us? Who can separate us from the love of God? And clearly, the answer to that question is no one. And we're going to look next at some further objections to Paul's gospel in 9 through 11.